Hello and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. We're coming back after a week's hiatus, so I'm sorry if you missed us, and I didn't really announce what was happening, but I was on vacation, so sorry if you were surprised by no episode. And fair warning, I'll also not be releasing an episode next week as I'll be away at a work/travel obligation. I'll be out of town for something related to my job here at the church, so there will be no podcast episode. But for now, welcome back and I hope you're having a good summer. Things have been spread out all over the place here at Northwood, and by things I mean people. People have traveled and have gravitated to their various summertime activities. So there are many in our community who I've seen very little of late, perhaps only in passing. Either way, I'm glad you're here. And now that fall is approaching, maybe things will start to settle down and we'll all be in the same spaces all at once again. That's coming. But before we dive into everything else, I want you to know that this podcast is produced and distributed by the All Indiana Podcast Network. The All Indiana Podcast Network, well, it's all in the name. They produce and distribute podcasts made in the state of Indiana and often about topics of interest to Hoosiers specifically, we people in Indiana. But their topics run the gambit from sports to local news to the weather to politics. I even saw one that was about pets that they provide. So the topics run the gambit. Check them out. Chances are you'll find more that interests you there. In the meantime, we being Northwood Christian Church and the Northwood Podcast, we have a website. It's www.indncc.org. That's INDYNCC.org. And it's been a while since our website has had a significant overhaul, and it's perhaps due. But you can still find information about us that is useful, our service times, contact information, or about the various tenants that occupy space in our building, not to mention recordings of past services and past sermons preached, or links to the YouTube page where you can find Bible studies and other material that we have made. So check that out if you like, or reach out to us by way of the contact info that you find there, or I'll just make that part simple. If you want to write into us, or to namely me, best place to do that is at my email, which is my name, Heath, Heath, at ndncc.org. That's Heath at ndncc.org. Lastly, before you go, I hope that you take the time to give this video a thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube, or subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. You might even leave us a comment if you're feeling especially spry. I've been told that these points of contact will help our channel out a lot. Or if you're listening to this as a podcast, please follow or subscribe. Most apps that people use to listen to podcasts on have a place where you can click to follow whatever podcast that you are listening to or have interest in, so that you can receive updates whenever new episodes are released. So before you go, you should follow or subscribe, or however your app frames it, and you should leave a rating or a comment there as well, as I'm told that will help us, and even if it doesn't help bring more traffic our way, it'll give us an indication of how we're doing and how we may improve. But enough housekeeping. Here in a moment, we'll be going over a parable that is found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13. But first, we'll need to pause for some ads for our podcast audience. So, we'll see you again after the break. And we're back. And as I was saying, today we'll be going over a passage found in Matthew chapter 13, more specifically Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30, and then jumping over to verses 36 through 43. Why are we skipping those verses in between? Well, I should just say up front, to avoid confusion, that the reason the verses that we're reading are broken up like this is because that's how they're presented in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus first tells the parable to a large crowd, and then later is in Matthew it's recorded him explaining privately to the disciples more about that parable. So that gap in between reflects the dialogue that Jesus gave in the moments in between. So I hope that helps. Here it is, Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30, and then jumping to verses 36 through 43. And they read, Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like someone who planted good seed in his field. While people were sleeping, an enemy came and planted weeds among the wheat and went away. When the stalk sprouted and bore grain, then the weeds also appeared. The servants of the landowner came and said to him, Master, didn't you plant good seed in your field? Then how is it that it has weeds? An enemy has done this, he answered. The servant said to him, Do you want us to go and gather them in? But the landowner said, No, because if you gather the weeds, you'll pull up the wheat along with them. Let both grow side by side until the harvest. And at harvest time, I'll say to the harvesters, First gather the weeds and tie them together in bundles to be burned, but bring the wheat into my barn. Jesus left the crowds and went into the house. His disciples came to him and said, Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. Jesus replied, The one who plants the good seed is the human one. The field is the world, and the good seeds are the followers of the kingdom, but the weeds are the followers of the evil one. The enemy who planted them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the present age. The harvesters are the angels. Just as people gather weeds and burn them in the fire, so it will be at the end of the present age. The human one, or other translations read the Son of Man, will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all things that cause people to fall away and all people who sin. He will throw them into a burning furnace. People there will be weeping and grinding their teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in their Father's kingdom. Those who have ears should hear. Take a pause. I'm feeling wow. This feeling of wow. I mean, those are some dire warnings intended for those who fail to accept life-giving ways. Very stark imagery. Fire and furnace. Jesus, we believe, embodied the life-giving ways that can be contrasted with the destructive ways that we see all around us, and the destruction that is reflected in those powerful images of fire at the end of this parable. As I read those last lines about the fiery furnace and the gnashing of teeth, which just is to cue us into abject human misery, I'm reminded there of the hell we find around us. A hell that has been created by humans as we've succumbed to fear and its counterpart, hatred, and then the violence that often follows, as well as our succumbing to greed and all of the destruction that greed brings with it. The point, many of the tendencies that seem baked into human nature will end in our destruction. Or so it seems, or so the parable prophesies. I mean, don't we see the evidence for this all around us? A planet that's heating up, cruelty at borders all over the globe as migrants flee environmental devastation or the destruction of wars in diverse places. In the centuries leading up to the life of Jesus, there came to be this idea within Judaism that a time would surely come when all that was wrong with the world would be corrected and sorted out. And that sort of feeling is reflected in this parable that Jesus tells. He is telling a parable or using examples like you might have heard in other people telling this story about a similar time when the end of the old ways would come and the new way would arrive. It simply has to be this way. That's the thought, that there must be a God, and if there is a God, and if that God is just, then this current order of things cannot go on. And I feel this now, and some people alive around the time of Jesus felt the same. So prophets would tell of a time when things would change. That's what Jesus is doing here. When what is wrong with the world and the human race will be made right. It's an it's an imaginative future. It's a hope. And here's an example of this kind of writing. I'll just read to you for someone else who said something similar. Quote, God will judge between the nations and settle disputes of mighty nations. Then they will beat their swords into iron plows and their spears into pruning tools. Nation will not take up sword against nation. They will no longer learn how to make war. Come, house of Jacob, let's walk by the Lord's light. That's from the 4th, 5th, and 6th verses of Isaiah chapter 2. And I chose those because this is one of the more memorable moments in the Hebrew Bible, one that Jesus would have been aware of, where a prophet casts a vision for his people's future. But it is not unlike other passages that you can find. There are several others like it. And what I want you to notice is that this future that is envisioned by the prophets involves a reconciliation between nations. So that's tribalism resolved. I would even expand that to tribalism in our own nation and diverse political parties and divisions that haunt us. So a part of this process involves that, but also weapons of war being recycled and turned into tools that cultivate life. Pruning, hooks, and plowshares. And plows are good for growing food. And so here is portrayed a time when the right priorities will dictate human behavior. This is the time referred to in the Bible as a new heaven and a new earth. But what that transition between the world as we know it now and the world to come, what would that look like? Because the violence and greed that wreck us now are so baked into our human experience, it seems intuitive that the transition between all of this and the realm of God will be as unsettling to us as it is to have perhaps a mass removed from any body, painful and in ways destructive. And when we consider how tumultuous moments of societal transition have been in the past, this all makes a lot of sense. All that fire Jesus described, that is how it feels. Think of how calamitous the world felt near and around the Civil War, for instance, or during the Civil Rights era, or Vietnam, late 1960s, early 70s. There are many other examples I could cite from our own history, but for Jesus, by the time of Jesus, Israel had experienced similar, though different periods of tumultuous transitions, but also revivals, the good and the bad, sometimes brought in by fire. So when prophets wrote or spoke of the transition they believed was coming, they described this transition in powerful poetic language and imagery to describe this moment, such as we find in this passage. This is the idea reflected in the explanation Jesus gave for this parable about the wheat and the weeds. That bit at the end about the fire that consumes the wicked is not to be taken as a literal description of what comes next for the evilest humans or for the human race. People who have lived in a way that destroys. But it's rather a way to imagine what it might be like when the God of love, who is passionate, and is passionate about justice, when that God has a confrontation with those who have harmed God's children, those who have brought hell into our lives. It seems intuitive to us that for those who harm others, they should face a reckoning, you, me, and us all, and the most evil people in the human race. So eventually, Christians look forward to a time when what is wrong with our world has been sifted and sorted out. And this parable is about those times. Now, there are some who look forward eagerly to this time, should it come. This is usually because we often assume that we are among the wheat. We identify within this parable with the wheat. So we look forward to a time when we are sorted into the category of righteous. And I'm not sure, actually, this is hyperbolic language here. I'm not sure that this is a healthy attitude. It's not. I'm not suggesting that we should live in abject fear of God's fiery wrath, but I do think that some humility should be in order, especially when we're trying to sort humans out between the righteous and the damned. After all, the self-proclaimed righteous are often the most difficult to put up with, But there are perhaps more people who look forward to the time when the weeds are separated from the wheat because they imagine that the weeds are those sorts of people that they already conveniently don't like or have decided will not belong in the realm of God. I can remember sermons that made this point plainly. A time is coming when the sinners will all face God, and then it will be too late, says the preacher. And all of God's people said, good riddance. Ugh. In many ages of the church, we have designated certain people groups as weeds. Just a blanket statement. Weeds fit for God's destruction. Which could be code for, we don't want those kind of people in our lives. How convenient it is for us when our alleged enemies happen to also be the same ones God disapproves of. Almost too convenient, really. Almost makes you wonder. I see many problems with this mentality. You may hear it in my tone, as did Jesus. One problem is that it hurts our hearts to think this way. When we hold judgment in our hearts for another and condemn them, and believe that we have successfully weighed them and found them wanting, well, think about those times when you have done this. How did it feel to hold on to those feelings, to nurture them, to stoke those flames, resentment, hatred, fear, and all that sometimes goes with judgment? Well, that will hurt our hearts. So that's one problem with a judgmental mind and a heart, one that's trying to sift between the wheat and the weeds. Another is that when humans judge between humans, we will inevitably, nearly always get things wrong. Perhaps we'll get the whole thing wrong. And one point of this parable is that we really ought not to try to separate the weeds from the wheat because we will nearly always get things wrong, perhaps very, very wrong. And I'll explain by way of a real story from my own life. I have never been much of a gardener. I have tried several times. I just don't seem to have it. The green thumb or whatever makes a good gardener. And what's more, I really haven't had the interest. I said I've tried several times, but they've been half-hearted attempts out of obligation. It's just not for me. My wife, though, she has been trying of late to learn these skills, and she seems very interested. In fact, she seems to be enjoying it. And she's coming along quite well from what I can tell. However, I am not, and I'm not putting in the effort, so why should I? So she usually wants me far away from her work, especially when I'm mowing or pulling weeds, because she knows that I'm liable to undo or destroy the life she has cultivated. For example, there's a flower bed just behind our house that I mowed last summer. Just mowed them down. I didn't know I was mowing flowers. They looked to me just like the weeds, which is my wife's point. If you don't know what you're doing, don't touch it, or you might do unforeseen or perhaps devastating damage. So leave it alone and leave it to the one who knows. And if you understand this, then you understand one of the more important meanings, or perhaps the main point of today's parable. For you see, there was a weed that grows where Jesus lived, then and now, that looks a whole lot like wheat. And it's thought by biblical commentators that this is the plant that Jesus has in mind in this parable. And that plant is called darnel, or darnel. I hope I'm not saying that wrong. Darnel it's a poisonous weed that is common in that area in Palestine, and it was bad for it to be mixed with the wheat because it's toxic. So one would think that the best course of action would be for the servants to pull the weeds before they really get going. Thing is, it being hard to tell the difference between the two, chances are the servants might pull up a whole lot of wheat along with the weeds. So the landowner says, "Don't touch it. Leave it to me. I will be able to tell the difference in the end." Similar to judge not lest ye be judged, isn't it, in this context? Because the landowner knows. The landowner in the story is the one who can properly sort the wheat from the weeds because, well, the landowner is the allegorical representation of God. aren't they? So then, bring it back into our context, or really to any church. Churches are filled with all kinds of people. And our propensity to judge others does cause us to sort them into categories about who fits in and where they fit. And not only is judging bad for our hearts and souls, as I've described, but we will always inevitably get things wrong. You know it's so. Occasionally I, a parent, will make a judgment between my children only to find out later that I did not know the whole story. I've even punished my children for things that I found out later they did not do. Felt real bad. Perhaps they were framed by a sibling. Who knows? Either way, I get it wrong, and this hurts them. It hurts them. And you know the feeling. To be unfairly judged and condemned, it can crush you if it's that serious. It hurts us to be unfairly and unjustly judged. In fact, it hurts everyone involved. Jesus teaches us through this parable, leave it all in the ground. The landowner asks the servants to do nothing, allowing the wheat and the weeds to coexist together until the very end. We are to picture here a community filled with all kinds of people, wheat and weeds, everything in between. The point, leave it to God to do the sorting. God is the only one who truly knows us. There are people in the church who are very wheat-like, or at least appear wheat-like, who hide and hold secrets, who perhaps live like hypocrites or hurt others in private. Then there are people who appear to some to be very weed-like, who have in many ways the very heart of God and a heart full of love. Only we cannot see it because we are human and only see so much in another child of God. So I'll say it again, best leave the sorting to God. But alas, we all too often take it upon ourselves to separate wheat from weeds. In the past, this was called excommunication. And while we might not excommunicate in the formal sense in our churches, we still have our own ways of excluding those that we consider weeds in our midst. We think we know who's in and who's out, so we spend our time keeping our field, our church, our life pure. But we will be held accountable for the damage we cause in the meantime, when we take it upon ourselves to do the job only God can do in the end. This parable is for Christians who have long prided themselves at being good sorters, at identifying who is in and who is out in the realm of God, who the saints and the sinners are. This parable is for you if you think you know that, because you don't. This mentality is not at all rare. In fact, unfortunately, judging others is one of the things Christians are known for. And of this tendency, biblical commentator and scholar Barbara Reed writes, do people in the congregation struggle with dualistic tendencies, seeing the world in clear categories of right and wrong, good and evil, and putting themselves as the champions of the right? Then the parable of the weeds and the wheat can invite them into a less judgmental and less self-righteous stance. It opens up a worldview in which ambiguity exists and where God's realm is revealed in the midst of conflictive situations, i.e., while the weeds and the wheat are growing together. Not only in their resolution at the harvest, when the separation occurs, it invites the hearer to compassionate forbearance, which would allow people of differing ideologies and theologies to remain together in the same community. Again, that's Barbara Reed, end quote. So who are the ones you have decided are weeds? It's not for you to decide. Let it go. What kind of individual have you set aside as one fit to be removed from God's harvest? Let it go. It is probably the sort of person with whom you can't agree with on anything. They probably think different, vote different, dress different, talk different, have a different theology. Can you imagine all that living in the same church? It's supposed to. And what you want to do, maybe, is remove them from your church life or even from your life. Well, if that describes you, this parable asks you to humbly admit that you do not truly know the heart of another, just as only God really knows yours. So leave it be. Live well alongside all others as best as you are able in the meantime. God will sort us out, healing what may be healed and removing all that corrupts from the human race and the human heart. When I consider how this parable calls us to be as a church, I imagine a church filled with all kinds of people, not only who look different, but think different, love different. I imagine a church that refuses to set the alleged weeds at a distance, but welcomes them in love. But wait, that isn't even far enough. Turns out we aren't even meant to identify them as weeds at all. And when you try, as I keep saying, you'll nearly always get it wrong. So instead, all persons are to be treated with the full dignity they possess as God's children nonstop. So stop trying to determine who's in, who's out. We are not called to judge anyone's heart of hearts. Instead, we are called to love them with the love of Christ to the very end. And that is today's point. And does this describe us? Is this who we are, brother and sister Christian? Either way, this is how we ought to be.